Hi, and welcome to another edition of Killing the Church. I'm Brad, and you're not. Um, we've got something pretty neat today, I think. It's an interesting topic that doesn't get talked about a whole lot, so we're gonna address it finally from a Christian perspective, from a biblical perspective. Before that, just the typical announcements. Up in this corner right here is a QR code that will take you to a fundraiser we are doing for a series on the Gospel of John that will be led by an actual Hasidic rabbi who will explain the Gospel of John from a Hasidic perspective. Other than that, we also have a partnership that we've begun, or a sponsorship from Bible Lingo. Bible Lingo is an organization that endeavors to teach people the biblical languages so they can read the biblical text in its original languages, or at least in the languages of the manuscripts that we have. So wonderful organization. They also have homeschool content, which I'm also very partial to. The code for that is AM15, get you 15% off. And as usual, I've got some beverages with me, doing a Voodoo Ranger hazy juicy IPA, and still working on some Basil Hayden. So without further ado, let's bring up the video. And we're going to be talking about explicit literature. And that's something that I don't think gets enough attention, right? Every man who's ever been to a church ever at any point in his life has heard a sermon about how damaging pornography is. And I don't disagree. I agree with that 100%. I think that is something that men do need to hear. I'm not saying say that less, but something that is not given almost any attention at all in Christian circles is the problem of smut for women. I don't think I've ever met a woman who's ever heard a church service about erotic literature and how damaging that is for women. Or really, I don't think I've ever heard it acknowledged as a problem in any church. It's never mentioned. It's never brought up. It never gets any attention. And so one might even think that it's just not that widespread of a problem, right? It's certainly not as widespread as pornography for men. That might be the idea that people get, but it really couldn't be farther from the truth. And so there is a YouTuber who primarily engages with content about literature. She is an author, and she does content on authorship and writing. But she did a particularly good piece on this topic, and that is what we will be reviewing. So without further ado, bring the video up, and we're off.
When I started this channel, it was largely because I had been noticing a broad decline in storytelling in general and literature in particular, a decline that began a lot longer ago than most people think. And my aim has always been to help, insofar as I am able, to remind writers of the true fundamentals of storytelling, and to hopefully elevate their craft into something that isn't beholden to current market trends, nor controlled by the fleeting tastes of book talk or bookstagram or whatever. However, I've been noticing that there are a lot more aspects that have been contributing to the decline of literature besides just a lack of understanding regarding the fundamentals. Today, I would like to focus on one of the most glaring issues plaguing modern publishing.
So I would agree. Writing in general, in totality, has kind of gone downhill. It's not really progressed with time. It's actually just gotten worse, but that can be said for basically everything else in society. But wow, what a place to pause it. But this is a particular problem that is part of the degradation of writing, and maybe she'll speak on it some to a point where I can add kind of where my thoughts are on it. But we'll let her continue. That is an incredible amount of...
Something you hear a lot is that women have come to dominate the literary world more and more. We'll look closer at those numbers later, but for now I think we can all agree that female writers have achieved fame and success comparable to a lot of their male predecessors and contemporaries. But the female writing, which is most often presented as proof of this, is things like this, despite the fact that there have always existed things like this.
Sarah J. Maas. There's the thing. I don't read this content, but I know who she is because that's how prevalent this content has become in society, right? She's practically, and I'm going to hate myself for saying this, all of my other fellow Lord of the Rings fans are going to hate me for saying this. She's basically become the J.R.R. Tolkien of like feminine literature, and that is a travesty for multiple reasons that we might be able to get into.
This. I'm personally of the opinion that the literary world is so rife with corruption and ideologies that any observation.
Yeah, there was an era of literature that was actually very good. Like it was very good literature that was written by women. So like women have always been able to write good literature. That's never really been in question. Some of the absolute classics are written by women. Like this is, so how did we shift from that? Why is that not considered women's literature now? Well, Frankenstein kind of appeals to everybody. It's not specific to women. So let's hear what she has to say.
Observation along these lines is meaningless. Generally, across the board, it isn't really men or women who dominate the literary world. It's ideologies and popular trends in social politics, whatever those might be at a given time. Historically, a lot, not all, but a lot of the most widely celebrated female writers, especially within the 20th and 21st centuries, have been at the bleeding edge of social and political progressivism. To my mind, this makes it less about being a woman and more about being an acolyte of a particular idea.
That's actually not new, though. Progressivism or liberalism, leftism, right? These ideologies, they actually go back much farther than we think. And even in the early colonial days, if there was a political agenda that we would probably dignify as being more left than what was, considered normal back then, they actually would use women to propagate it. They would send women out to start speaking about it and trying to popularize it in society. And the reason was because even if it came to a problem of legality, women would receive less harsh sentences for it, right? Women might not even spend a day in the stocks for it, might just give a fine or something like that. Whereas like if men were to speak that same way about the same thing, men would receive harsher sentences. So what she's talking about is actually not new. It might be more prevalent now, but it's definitely not new, and it's always been happening.
Theology. Like I said, though, not always, just most of the time. Nevertheless, it is somewhat true that right now women somewhat dominate the publishing industry.
Right.
First of all, some housekeeping. Apparently, I will be punished in some mysterious way if I use a certain word in my videos.
Porn.
This word has 4 letters, starts with a P, ends with an N, and there's also an O and an R in there too. So for the course of this video, I'll have to refer to it differently. I'm going to use adult entertainment or adult videos or...
I'm not going to do that. It's porn or pornography. You might actually, if everybody's just said the full word, people might actually not get flagged as much. I don't know why that is the case, but that appears to be the case in my experience. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to use circumlocutions. It's pornography. It's porn. That's what she's talking about. That is a big issue in society today.
Or explicit videos. I don't know. None of these words quite have the same meaning, but you and I both know what we're talking about here, so let's just make do. All right, to start with, let's just push aside any conversation about taste. This is not going to be a video about what I like or don't like to read. What I am offering you in this video is not my opinion or my reading preference, it is facts. And the first thing we need to establish is that all this so-called romance fiction and most, if not all, of the current women's literature out there is not women's literature. It's... As a woman, the most common defense I hear for romance fiction, especially the romance fiction that is so prevalent today, is that it is literature for women. Whenever anyone tries to express some concern about these genres or the nature of their content, that person is immediately condemned for being anti-woman or anti-women's literature. The idea being that these types of books are...
because the patriarchy is one criticism. Right? Because women like this, then it's sexist for you to criticize it. Like, oh, like just what an awful reasoning. But I mean, that tracks with feminism, though.
Are not just popular among women, but that they define womanhood. And to be opposed to them in any way is to be opposed to women.
Because womanhood is when uncontrolled sex. Like, how do you get this ideology? Like, how does somebody come well, there, you know what? There's Midrashim that would speak to this to some degree. What I just said is actually not inherently wrong. It's just wrong. If you know, you know.
Women such as myself who are critical of these books are often said to be suffering from internalized misogyny. The reality about all this,
right, because women are such independent thinkers that they never disagree with other women. Right, because you're not allowed to have your own opinion. You must affirm what the sisterhood declares, and the sisterhood declares that sex in book is essential to being woman. I don't make the rules. This is what they've decided.
is that it isn't a question of woman versus anti-woman or even woman versus man. The issue here is probably one of the oldest ones in existence. It's the normalization of explicit adult entertainment.
Yep.
Whether it's women or men who are trying to do that is pretty irrelevant.
Let me address what she just said there too, because I agree with it. This is not a woman versus men issue. This is not a woman versus anti-woman issue. This is an issue of things that are debauch being normalized in society. They're being made mainstream and accessible to everyone everywhere, and that is wrong. Okay. The only area where this could be construed in any way as like a battle of the sexes is because this is something that is relevant to women more so than men, that's how I began this, right? Men, they get talked to about pornography all the time, ad nauseum. Men hear about porn all the time, okay? And I'm not saying that should stop. I'm not. Continue with that. But let's give an equal amount of attention to this, which is equally a problem. And I do mean equally. I'm not over-exaggerating that. This is just one of those areas where what women have been engaged in that is not good for them, that is not good for society, that is not good for their relationships, has actually just been turned a blind eye to. Right. That's what I'm drawing attention to, is that it shouldn't be turned a blind eye to. We really should be treating men and women equally in this capacity, and that we are treating this problem as harshly as we treat pornography for men. That's all I'm saying.
Because the number one reason anyone has ever tried to normalize this kind of, explicit content is money. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. First of all, we need to establish this fact very, very clearly. Women's literature is not, just some randomly horny trend in the book industry. In that sense, outside of a handful of odd entries here and there, women's literature doesn't exist. Women haven't taken over the literary world. A 4-letter word starting with P has taken over the literary world.
Yes.
Barnes and Noble and every other major and independent bookseller, especially all those new romance.
One of the other things that she's not talking about here, she just said women's literature by and large doesn't exist. And I would say the same thing goes for like teenage boys' literature. Basically doesn't exist anymore. The things that we once would have thought are like boy literature, like fantasy, sci-fi, things like that, those have all also been co-opted by this. And they've been marketed predominantly to women, right? Gone are the days where you have like an actual strong masculine hero who has masculine virtues and values, and he overcomes the dragon and also the internal dragon in himself, right? And emerges victorious. Now everything has, biracial, lesbian, feminine hero type it's not just literature, it's video games, it's movies. We all know what Kathleen Kennedy did to Star Wars, which was a travesty like no other, equal to the burning of the library at Alexandria. I'm not willing to argue about that. I'm simply right. So this has just been happening all over. So it's not just that women's literature doesn't exist. It's that masculine literature also doesn't really exist anymore. And that's because you have all of these people trying to advertise to audiences that just don't take that kind of literature in. So, and that is obviously, like she said, it's something else is being pushed, right? A debauch culture is being pushed because it's lucrative, right? This is just another problem of billionaires trying to make money off of the baser human nature, rather than simply being competent and creative enough to make money on something that's actually beneficial to society.
Bookshops have now just become another kind of adult entertainment store. And no, that's not a good thing. Now, I know what you might be thinking. This is not XXX adult entertainment. This is. You are actually incorrect. For a man, average man, I don't know, reading an explicit depiction of a sex act might not really get the job done. Men typically tend to gravitate towards seeing the act on the screen in one form or another. Yeah. Women have always, on average, preferred to read it, even if some do end up hooked on the filmed version. The female mind has pretty much...
That's an interesting point. Because, yeah, the visual version of pornography has generally throughout time, by and large, been dominated with male viewership. But as time has crept on, more and more women have been getting involved with it, to the point that there are some stats that would actually show that it's pretty comparable between the genders, but there are certain issues of metadata that go into that. Generally speaking, it is still very accepted that by just over half, or I guess just over double the percentage of men utilize it versus women who utilize it. But like I said, within certain data sets, there has been shown an uptick of female viewership in which it is actually more so than the men. But we're getting a little niche here. Women generally do prefer to read their explicit content than to view it personally. However, reading it, and I think that's what she's getting at here, is that reading it seems to be a gateway into the visual version for a lot of women, which is interesting, because that would suggest that reading this kind of content puts these women in a frame of mind that actually makes them a little more masculine. I don't know. I would actually have to sit and ponder that a little bit more. But that could be one of the damages that gets done, because women aren't supposed to be masculine, and so that is damage being done to a woman if she is growing. Growing is not even the right word to use, but beginning to think more along masculine terms. Then that's not good for her. She is not supposed to think that way. Men are supposed to think that way.
The same reaction, generally speaking, to the written version. In fact, written erotic content tends to have even more of an impact on the minds of women than filmed erotic content. Why? Because men and women engage with media in fundamentally different ways. Yep. When it comes to adult entertainment, your simple, straightforward two people banging video isn't really going to do much of anything for a woman, generally speaking. There have been numerous studies done regarding female sexuality or the differences between male and female arousal, and generally across the board, they'll tell you that women require what is sometimes called mental mapping to be sexually aroused. That is, there needs to be more story and more opportunity for her to feel empathy. That's just how it is for a woman. Empathy is a huge factor for women in all aspects of their lives, but yes, especially when it comes to erotic media. With written explicit content, as opposed to your typical material found on...
They have to be able to see themselves as the main character from the story.
The hub, it's a lot easier for the woman to imagine herself as the female in the scene. In addition, as I said, women require an emotional element to their erotic content that is almost impossible in the simple filmed scenes that can so easily do it for men, typically. That is to say, watching Mrs. Smith bang the mailman while her husband is at work is plenty for most men. But a woman will want to know the whole story. She'll want this sexual tension that builds up between Mrs. Smith and the mailman over several encounters. The dangerous possibility that her husband might come home any minute. The explicit fact that the mailman chose her over all the other housewives on the street. And...
Because that's always how it's filtered, right? It's always, oh, he chose me. The mailman didn't choose just you. Oh man, like that, like that's just never how that's worked, right? That's the mailman is choosing all of you, not just you. But the funniest part about this to me is she's essentially saying women need the drama. That's what it is. Women need the drama. that's that is hilarious to me as a man, right? It's because, like, men need to see attractive women, right? Male sexuality is when attractive woman. It's pretty cut and dry, right? We see the pretty woman, and it's like, okay, now me ready for sex. Whereas women need the drama, and that's really all it is drama, which is why one of the other things, as far as romance movies, right? Romance movies, if you ask most women what their idea of one of the most romantic movies in the world, one of the most popular, is The Notebook. And The Notebook is actually just a story about cheating. And that goes for most of them. Before The Notebook, it was the Titanic. And the Titanic is also just a story about cheating, right? And so it's come to a point where it just seems like a woman's idea of romance, generally speaking, in the West, is actually just cheating, right? The drama that is involved in the cheating scenario is what makes it romantic to them, right? Whereas, and that's actually, it's anti-romance. Romance historically, and I don't know if she's got a video on this or if she talks about it in this video. I have seen this video, but it was over 9 months ago. Is that romance actually is traditionally was the hero's journey. The hero's journey is actually traditionally romance. That's what romance is. There wasn't really this extremely large part that the female in the story played, because she was the prize that was being won, essentially. Whereas for the masculine part, romance traditionally was man slay dragon, win the affections of woman. That is romance. Romance is the man has to battle this thing, right? Be it external or internal, there's some struggle that the man has to overcome. And in overcoming that, he wins the affections of the woman. And that is romance. We've gotten away from that to where now romance is when the woman has a choice between two men, generally speaking, one who's actually still pretty much a good man, more or less, who has a lot going for him and is probably wealthy. And rather than be loyal to him, she decides that she wants the man who has infinitely less going for him, and is possibly even a criminal or some homeless degenerate. But he excites some other thing inside her, and that's where the romance ensues.
So on and so on. A woman would also prefer some kind of story to bind it all together. That's just how women are. If you put explicit sex scenes into a novel-length story, it's going to hit a woman's mind in much the same way the top video on the hub hits a guy. As I said, that's just how...
Yeah. The effects on the brain are identical. If you look at a male's brain scans after he has viewed video pornography, and a woman's brain after having consumed smut, they are identical. They have the exact same effect. And that's a fact that doesn't get talked about enough, is that they are in fact identical. And there's an incredible disparity in the way that they're both treated socially. And that's part of the problem too.
Women are. A lot of men might hear this and be a little dubious. And in fact, I've found that a lot of men, while they might raise their eyebrows a little at just how explicit women's books have become in recent years, they won't really go as far as to categorize them the same way as, the kind of thing you'd find on the hub. Male writers certainly find such classification baffling, but let me break down how this works for women. If you look at your average popular romantasy book, those books that have dominated book sales for a few years now, and which are among the worst offenders when it comes to wildly explicit content, the explicit scenes coincide with the story to some degree. Now, the authors of these stories will tell you that these sex scenes are there for narrative purposes. They serve either plot development or character development. I don't think that.
Could you imagine? Could you imagine if somebody argued, if a director argued that putting a sex scene in a blockbuster movie was for plot development, like it serves the plot somehow? Like that's the number one criticism that I think everybody can agree on, is that sex scenes in movies literally add nothing. They do absolutely nothing for the story. Matter of fact, there used to be an organization called Cleanflix. That would edit movies, and they would edit out profanity. They would edit out like gratuitous violence where it was unnecessary. And I specify that because things like Saving Private Ryan and Hacksaw Ridge and like period piece war movies, there is a value that is served by the violence that you see in that. To show the horror of war actually is part of the point of those movies. But for other things where it's unnecessary, they cut that out, and they would cut sex scenes out. And it wasn't like hard cuts or anything. It was usually a fade from one scene to another. They did it very professionally. It was very well done. And the movie was not less for it. It was very tastefully done. And you wouldn't know that was the case. Matter of fact, I think I watched the first Terminator movie from Cleanflix. And I went most of my life having never known that there was an explicit sex scene in that movie until I was much later in life, into adulthood, and rewatching it, and was like, oh wow, I had no idea that was in here, because the cut from one scene to another was so well done that you would never have known that scene was even there, because that scene offers nothing to the movie. The movie was just as perfect, more perfect even, because it didn't have that flaw in it. It was a great Terminator's a great movie when you don't have all the nonsense in there. So yeah, it's just wild to argue that for literary purposes that it serves the plot, because it doesn't.
It's necessarily true, but let's go with it. Keep in mind what I said about how women engage with erotic content versus how men do. Let's take Sarah J. Maas, for example. I shouldn't have to tell you who she is and why she's relevant to this conversation, but if you don't know, let me just say that she's the woman responsible for the series of books commonly referred to as... Skilled writers such as Maas understand how the story shape of all aspects of storytelling affects reader engagement. We've talked about this before on this channel. Stories, and even their individual components, must have a story shape. That is, at least one character trying to achieve a goal with some kind of opposition to that goal, culminating in a mini climax in which the character achieves success or failure, or some unexpected thing happens. That's a story shape. Maas is actually pretty good at using this story shape to create fairly well-paced, if highly formulaic stories that really draw the reader in. I mean, anyone can write smut, but not everyone can sell millions of copies worldwide. Whether or not her stories are good stories, I don't... The point is, she understands how the thing works, but then she applies this same story shape to her sex scenes. Of course, I shouldn't have to tell you how sex scenes themselves have a story shape. She has stated in many interviews that she endeavors to make sure her sex is plot relevant. A big way she does that is to have the erotic scenes take place at the come down immediately after a major plot mini-climax. This incorporates the emotional release of the narrative with the sexual release of the erotic scene. She stated that she often tries to make the significant sex scenes, such as that 2 or 3 day sex marathon, occur at the close of equally significant plot arcs. This is ideal for the female brain, which already seeks a story shape even in sexually explicit content. But from a reader engagement plus female...
So she makes the drama match the pace of the intimate parts of her novels, right? She integrates the intimacy into specific points of the drama. Which that in itself is highly formulaic. I don't get the stigma behind using formula. It's the same thing in music, actually. There is a particular type of snobbery that exists for pretty much everything, where people hate on the use of successful formula because it is successful formula. And in music in particular, like it's happened with numerous bands. Nickelback is one of them. Creed was one of them. Nirvana is one of them. Matter of fact, Nirvana is a particularly good example because they came out with Smells Like Teen Spirit, which follows the formula. And there is basically one singular formula to writing a like basic rock hit. And Nirvana did that. And there's another band called Plur. Some of you might know Plur. A lot of you might not know Plur. And that is because Plur only has one noteworthy song that anybody knows. And Plur is a band full of these types of snobs that they absolutely despised Nirvana because of Smells Like Teen Spirit and the formulaic pattern that it does. And they said very much the same thing, that anybody could write that. And so they wrote a song to prove this point, just to prove how base level and unthoughtful and talentless it was to write a song according to this formula. And so they wrote a song essentially following the exact same formula as Smells Like Teen Spirit. And instead of actually, writing meaningful lyrics, they actually just strung together a bunch of phrases. And like when you read the lyrics to this song, it doesn't make any sense because it wasn't meant to, because that was part of the diss, is that they weren't actually going to spend time investing in actual lyrics. They just wrote phrases together and put it to the formulaic music of the song. And that song is called Song 2, and it is the only song that Plur was ever known by. So it's a little bit of poetic justice for that kind of snobbery. It's like, right, you can be a snob about it if you want, but when you mock it, the reality is that's going to be the only thing that you've ever done that people know, because that's what the general populace likes. The general populace is not made up of snobs like that. The general populace is made up of people who enjoy the formula. That's why the formula works. And so the same thing exists in literature. And when it comes to fantasy in particular, that formula does seem to have been set as a standard by J.R.R. Tolkien, right? Lord of the Rings is basically the Bible of fantasy. It is the standard that everybody has set to define themselves either against or in contradistinction to for all of those other snobs. But the most successful fantasies have generally followed the same formula in one way or another.
Adult entertainment perspective, this means that Mass has doubly hooked her female readers. The story and the extremely explicit content have become inextricably linked, and the explicit aspects have been delivered via the story in precisely the most ideal way necessary to capture the infatuation of the female reader. Another interesting thing to note, if you're not yet sold on the fact that all of this so-called women's lit is little more than, four-letter word starts with P, have a look at how much women's fiction has become subject to categorization norms that you don't see outside like the hub or fan fiction, which has become just another form of debauched adult entertainment. Sure, yeah, okay, fan fiction that isn't smut does theoretically exist, I guess, but that's like saying there are non-explicit OnlyFans creators. Within those spheres, the common term used for this categorization is a narrative one, or even a literary one. Trope. People talk about tropes all the time. Tropes are fine. There's nothing wrong with them. They're a common tool for literary analysis. A little reductive, a little ridiculously overutilized, but benign in the...
So she seems to be just a little bit of one of these kind of snobs, because I would argue that tropes are actually essential to good storytelling. If you're trying to write a story outside of these tropes, it's probably going to be a story that only the snobs actually appreciate, which I can respect, right? Because I'm a musician. I like metal. I like a lot of non-formulaic metal, which metal has its own formulas, and that's the other thing. So when I say non-formulaic, I mean it doesn't follow the formula that Smells Like Teen Spirit followed, but metal music has its own formulas that are followed. And I, in my own writing process, have used a lot of those formulas. Because to reach the broader audience, you kind of have to, because if you're writing something that is so niche that only other snobs are going to actually enjoy it, which metal by and large is that way, right? There, you do meet people who listen to metal just because they like metal. But in my personal experience, and this is anecdotal, I've met far more metal fans who are themselves musicians, right? And that's what they appreciate about metal, is the music theory that has gone into writing it. Even that, some of the formulas do still get criticized by some of the metal snobs out there. But they are listening to bands that only they know, right? And nobody else knows them, because everybody, even within the metal community, does generally tend to like the formulaic bands that exist. So I would say that tropes are basically essential to writing a story that's going to reach a broader audience. It's going to impact more people. Tropes are important. Um, so I didn't mean to make this a whole criticism of literature and the way that it's being treated, but it's part of the process. Let's just accept it.
Themselves. But the important factor to note here is this. When it comes to women's arousal, they need far more specific things than men do. So a woman's sexual entertainment tastes will always be 1,000 times more specific than a man's. So when a woman seeks out a new book, she'll look for specific cocktails of tropes for that thing she needs to feed her specific hungers. Or, I guess, thirsts. A quick perusal of the book recommendation section of the romance books subreddit will destroy any remaining illusions you might have had that these books are about anything other than sexual arousal. Just take a moment and look at some of these. Can you honestly say that this attitude towards women's fiction has to do with anything other than sex? I spent a little time while I was researching this subject talking to women and reading the accounts of women who were struggling with the addiction to hardcore content. A solid 90 to 95% of them started with erotic fiction, or smut, as they often called it, and fan fiction. A few stated that they didn't really ever get into videos, often because videos couldn't feed their precise needs.
Oh, so that's an interesting thing because fan fiction has played a huge part in this. And that is because a lot of this kind of content actually is just fan fiction. Matter of fact, a lot of the most popular versions of this are fan fiction. And that's because a lot of it is self-insert, and most fan fiction is to that endeavor. I would actually say particularly when it comes to women. All right. A lot of female authored fan fiction is just self-insert content. It's where they've actually just written themselves into their literature so that they can vicariously live out whatever fantasy they have by living through the character that they've written. Whereas a lot of male written content can also be self-insert, but it's actually more fractured. It's a little more complex. For instance, when you do like a huge study on J.R.R. Tolkien, and I'm probably going to bring him up a lot here just because he is one of the literary greats of the 20th century. He has inserted himself into the Lord of the Rings, but it's not just one individual character. He has actually mastered the ability to fracture the parts of himself that he wants to insert into the novel, and he's integrated that into multiple characters. And at some subconscious level, this happens with every writing process, right? Because you are the one writing, part of you is going to come out in every aspect of the writing, and so therefore also every character within the writing. But Tolkien really captured a lot of the different virtues and values that he espoused. And maybe this even was subconscious in and of itself. I'm not saying that he consciously did this, but he did it in a way that can only be described as masterful, in the way that he integrated his personal life and experience into multiple of the characters throughout his story and anthology. Whereas the typical Mary Sue was a self-insert into Star Trek fan fiction. And I'm sure a lot of you are probably very familiar with the 50 Shades series, because the 50 Shades series was spammed all over society for everybody, and you really couldn't even run away from it, even if you tried. Everybody became familiar with it in some capacity. And that was, believe it or not, Twilight fan fiction. That's what it was. It was Twilight fan fiction, which Twilight in and of itself was also self-insert fantasy. The author of Twilight, if you look at pictures of her, even when she was younger, and you look at the description of the main protagonist, Bella, and even the actress who was chosen to play the main protagonist, it's very obvious that this was all self-insert content. So, it makes sense. Or women need the drama, and so they write themselves into the drama. And because women are highly empathetic, women can read themselves into that self-insert writing. where the drama is what they want.
Several mentioned that they had quit the video content only to fall back on erotic fiction and had happily arrived at the realization that there was functionally no difference between the two. I read an account from one woman who noted,
You know what? Credit where it's due. That's incredibly self-aware for somebody who was reading the content and then went into the video content only to then revert back to the reading content and deciding for themselves that there's basically no difference between the two for them. That's incredibly self-aware. And that's a good thing, because that means that these are women who are thinking about it enough to where they could independently arrive at the conclusion that they need to make a change. That's good. That's a good thing.
Noted that she preferred written smut because within books and fan fiction, she was able to find things that would have been illegal in video form. So that's nice. I learned, too, that there was a worryingly large set.
Hold on, what? So she preferred the written version because she could find things in the written version that would have been illegal to videotape. Think about what's being said there. That's wild.
Subset of these women, some as young as 17, whose taste became so depraved so quickly that they were now suffering from something called POCD. I'll let you look that one up yourself.
Actually, hang on. I'm gonna look that up. POCD. Oh. All right. You can look this up also. It is P3Dophilia themed obsessive compulsive disorder. So it's OCD with a specific theme towards P3DO natured stuff. Wow. So that's the kind of content that, wow. And one of the things that strikes me here is that this is readily available on every bookstore's bookshelf. This kind of content, it's not censored, it's not gatekept, it's not protected the same way as even like regular normal pornography, because this would be illegal in video form. Wow.
Several women and teenagers remarked that they wished they had never started reading erotic fiction when they were younger, as they believed it had destroyed their lives. The thing is, just as with people's tastes in hardcore video subgenres, these tastes, these hungers, will intensify over time. The same mechanic is at play as you see in men who have to constantly seek harder and harder filmed content in order to even be aroused. Yeah. For that reason, more and more women's fiction has been including very, very dark material, be it disturbing age gaps, torture, abuse, even rape. Women don't start out wanting fantasy fiction. That's something that happens over time as they become desensitized to more mainstream content. I don't know how many videos and reviews I've seen by very young teenage girls who say the explicit sex in Sarah J. Maas's books is very mediocre and vanilla. That would be...
Wow. And one thing she just touched on there, she said even SA content, and that is one that just, because it'll get my video flagged. I don't think pornography will, but grape, we'll call it. That word actually will. And it's not even to the point that it's that women are attracted to, even grape content. That actually is the number one fantasy among Western women right now. It's like that's like one of the main things they look for in this kind of content, and it's one of the main things that they fantasize about. And she's right. Women don't start that way. That is unnatural at every level. And it's It's a little oxymoronic because that's one of the main grievances that women have regarding men, right? Because they believe we have this grape culture broadly in society, which is kind of blowing the problem out of proportion, because it's actually not as widespread of a problem as they are saying. And I have to qualify that because it is a widespread problem. It's a terrible thing. It's a travesty. The Torah says that men who do that should be executed, right? And I agree with that 100%. Not even just public executions. I believe in communal executions because that's what the Torah says, right? The Torah doesn't just say that there's an executioner whose job it is to execute this person. The Torah says that the community is supposed to take part in executing this person, specifically the grieved parties. But the fact that we've come to a point in society where that's actually that takes place as number one in sexual fantasy is wild. That is crazy that we've come to a point where that's how broken people's minds are. Just insane.
Because they're already desensitized and crave harder content. Honestly, though, by now I should have convinced you that these books are merely mass-produced hardcore adult entertainment and that their readership consumes them in much the same way one would consume any other form of, four-letter word starts with P, and that the result of that consumption, especially on a large enough scale and on a long enough timeline, is pretty much the same as any other form of hardcore entertainment addiction. So let's move on. Now, let's assume that you can get someone to concede that, yes, this is all, a written form of the same kind of crap you'd find on the hub. At that point, what happens is someone will insist that this is somehow the ethical type of adult entertainment. We'll get to that. Or they'll start trying to argue that this kind of written explicit content has positive effects. I've heard all these arguments. I've heard people say that the heavy amount of sex in these books creates some kind of sex-positive environment for female empowerment. I've heard people say that books like these increase readers' empathy. I've also, as I've said, been told that objecting to literature like this is inherently anti-women. First of all, let's talk about empathy and the chemical
Any excuse to avoid accountability. I don't understand how you could actually fall back on none of those arguments would fly when it comes to video pornography. None of them would fly. Men actually generally don't even make those arguments because men know that would never fly.
Reaction romance novels have on the female brain. There are so few studies that have been done on adult films' impact on women, and almost zero studies that have been done on erotic literature's impact on women. This is one of the most criminally understudied areas in human existence. Yep. Something I hear all the time is that romance novels increase the reader's empathy. I doubt it's that simple, but let's say it is. Women are empathetic by default. That is not something that romance literature gives women. It heightens it, certainly, but as in all emotions, a heightened state of anything is usually very bad. Heightened empathy reduces a person's logical response and cognitive reasoning. It makes it difficult to regulate the emotional response with reason. Heightened states of empathy have been found to contribute to pain, depression, anxiety, emotional overinvolvement, burnout, vicarious trauma, and post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, right out of the gate, this fact...
So think about what she's saying, too, is because heightened relative to what? Because women already have, as she just said, right? Women already have a heightened sense of empathy relative to men's sense of empathy. That actually is true. And one of the stranger things about that is that women actually children in general, tend to learn empathy from their experiences with their father. You can look into that. There have been studies done to that. And that's one of the crucial roles that a father plays, is because children learn empathy mainly from him. Mainly, not only, but mainly from him. And that's just strange because, men generally don't think in terms of themselves being empathetic. And she just said that a heightened sense of empathy can inhibit some of the more reason-based thought processes, which is generally how men identify more. Men identify far more as thinking on a reasonable level and a logical level, a rational level, than an empathetic one. And that's one of those areas where, okay, so men and women are different in that way, in that women already are more empathetic than men in certain capacities. There could be some argument there. Some of my younger brothers actually would probably have a lot to say about that. And maybe it would be cool to have them on sometime to actually flesh that out a little bit, because it's not that men actually aren't empathetic. Uh, their empathy just manifests in a very different way, because the rationale and logic and reason are employed along with the empathy, and so the empathy does not rule them that way.
The fact that romance books heighten empathy in readers is proof that despite the intentions of the writers, these books arouse readers, whether they want to be aroused or not, which is an unsettling thought all by itself. So imagine you're a young woman and you're reading a steamy romance in which the main female character is being mistreated in some way by the male character, and this female character feels arousal at this mistreatment. Written well, this arousal on the part of the female character will trigger empathetic arousal in the female reader. A young, inexperienced woman will then be troubled trying to understand why she's feeling aroused by what is borderline abusive behavior. However, the story will continue in this vein until the man and woman are living happily ever after. The moment of joy at the end is the emotional climax that is essential for a woman to fully enjoy an erotic romance. And no, I'm not saying women are super weak or something like that, but I think we can all agree that strong emotions are exhausting no matter who you are, and women are more prone to feel emotions strongly. An empathetic response to a romance book will result in an emotional roller coaster designed specifically to ensnare the tastes of women in such a way that their emotional involvement in a story will tend to be more intensive than a man's on average. Add to that the sexual infatuation triggered by the addictive erotic release of the extremely explicit scenes, which also takes a toll on the mind, whether you enjoy these scenes or not, especially if you do. I don't really understand why more people aren't aware of how intensely bad these books are for women's minds. I don't really read romance, smutty or otherwise, but I did read quite a few of these books when I was trying to understand the genre better. And something that really surprised me was how huge of an emotional impact they had on me. Despite the fact that I didn't care about these characters, and despite the fact that they were all mostly happy endings and everything else, I was legitimately depressed during the few weeks when I was reading these books. I was having trouble focusing on my work. I was having trouble sleeping. I was even having trouble eating. And I couldn't figure out what was wrong until it dawned on me that my mind was basically being ripped around a female-specific roller coaster that was designed to trigger the most extreme emotional and chemical reaction in my mind, short of actually doing drugs. Interestingly, the reaction I experienced was the same reaction men talk about when they watch filmed explicit content. The depression, the difficulty focusing, the lethargy. Women who are addicted to this sexually explicit fiction don't even realize that they're literally addicted to, adult entertainment. Without exception, men who are addicted to watching explicit content are viewed as bad. I shouldn't have to tell anyone watching this video how bad that is for the mind. It just happens that all the language surrounding this accepted fact says men's minds, how bad it is for men, how much damage it does to men. There have been countless studies done on the negative impact watching this stuff has on men's physical health and mental health, on their relationships, friendships, professional lives, and on their character. But basically 0 such studies have been done on women. Part of this is because most researchers won't acknowledge that women's addiction to erotic fiction is in any way comparable to a man's addiction to filmed erotic media. Part of it is because there's so much feminist armor packed around women's erotica that even if a woman were to watch the hub 10 hours a day, she would still somehow be protected by the fact that she's empowering herself or, exploring her sexuality. For social political reasons, most people won't touch that with a 10-foot pole. When it comes to men, this kind of content is known to have an enormous negative impact on their daily lives. Therefore, there are countless resources out there to help men kick that habit and restore sanity to them.
Part of this is because feminism can be summed up as male sexuality bad. That actually is just the main, which is a lot of the grievances that even I've heard regarding pornography. You get this general excuse, right, that it sets unreasonable standards for women, which is a very odd thing to argue. I get a lot of that is coming from old hat, much bygone era age, women who are used to a bygone era age of pornography, where it was all very professionally produced and whatnot. And you had this idea of airbrushed models and stuff like that, where today it's not really the same. The majority of that kind of media that is taken in by men is what's called amateur. So it's not some, you know, highly well paid, high status model who's doing it. It's Becky in a Motel 6 with her cell phone, right? And some dude that she's with, like that. That's what's popular out there right now. So the idea of airbrush models is really kind of a non-starter right now. It's actually kind of one of the most like realistic depictions of the average woman in society that you really could find. But in addition to that, um, it's it's one of those things where I'm trying to figure out how to put this delicately. You know what? Maybe I just won't. We'll just continue.
Lives. There's also a lot of shame among men. Men will mock other men for their addiction to this stuff. But for women, nothing. There are no resources to help women kick their addiction to erotic literature, at least none that I could find. And any woman who feels shame when reading this stuff is said to be suffering from internalized misogyny and is advised to focus on overcoming the stigma by, reading more of these books. Other women will help her in this endeavor. To this end, there are romance book clubs with completely expected names in which the pursuit of women's fiction can be enjoyed without shame. I read one account from a young woman who said that when she realized she was addicted, she sought help from a therapist who treated the matter as if it was nothing serious at all. No different from like a chocolate addiction. Addiction to appreciation of erotic literature is presented to women as female empowerment, and whatever various other hot words are part of the current feminist lexicon. If a woman were to express discomfort with the proliferation and increasing intensity of sexually explicit material in women's fiction, she is painted as an enemy, a prude, or, my personal favorite, a slave to the patriarchy. They'll say it allows women to explore their sexuality in a safe space. I'm pretty sure you could all
prude. So that's a way to maybe more lightly touch on what I was just trying to get at, prudishness, because a lot of the criticisms that I've heard from women are in the area of pornography presenting unrealistic standards for men. Is the idea that men have learned to like certain things from this kind of content, and to be sure, there are certain, I would say, extreme forms of this content that do in fact do that. But for like the general sex acts that like basically everybody is interested in, especially among Christian women, this criticism is prevalent because we have this idea that any alternatives to intimacy that would be procreative gets labeled in Christian circles as sodomy. It's all sodomy. Any kind of alternative entry points, let's say, it's just labeled as sodomy, and therefore is sinful. And men wouldn't like it if they didn't see it in a video form, because it's essentially just saying that like it's unnatural and it's not natural for men to want that. And that's not really true. The Bible actually addresses this, not so directly. It's kind of implicit in the Hebrew language that's used. But it's not unnatural for men to like these things. Men didn't learn it from watching pornography, because we wouldn't read about it in the Bible if men, had learned it from pornography. Now, the idea that pornography existed back then, there's a whole discussion that can be had about that. But these are things we read about in much more flowery language, even in the Song of Solomon. And even in spite of the flowery language, it's pretty obvious what's being described, and what's being described are these things. And so these criticisms generally come from a more prudish place that itself needs to be addressed. The Christian stigma around the topic of sex in general needs to be addressed, because a lot of that is where this puritanical ideology on intimacy in marriage comes from. And it's not inherently bad. It's not inherently evil as long as it's taking place inside a marriage, which is where it should take place. And both partners should be willing to try and satisfy each other in the ways that they need to be satisfied, provided that it isn't unnatural. And that's a broader discussion that could be had as to what is natural and unnatural. But I have studied that pretty extensively from a biblical perspective, looking into the original languages of passages that do discuss these things. And I can say with full confidence that those basic alternatives that are pretty popular in society today, the Bible does not forbid those. And maybe we here at Alternate Media can do like another behind closed doors segment where we take a deep dive into those, and it's a little bit more guarded, not easily accessible content, because we understand like we are trying to be family friendly for the most part, and that's something that maybe only adults really should listen to. Maybe this video is also something that only adults should listen to, but it's information that does need to be known, discussed, and addressed within the church, because Christian women are not excluded from the population that makes use of this kind of content.
Also say that men on the hub are exploring their sexuality in a safe space. I don't know. To which women will often argue, well, that kind of content, the stuff on the hub, is unethical. But that erotic literature, if they even concede that it's the same kind of content, is somehow ethical, meaning that, I'm assuming, no actors or actresses were harmed in its making. Be that as it may, the making of the explicit content is a separate issue from its consumption.
Thank you.
I'm sure you could find an ethical and environmentally friendly way to make heroin, wouldn't make it a good thing for me to consume it. A lot of people these days talk about how social bias prevented women from enjoying romance literature.
Making a nuclear bomb is not the same thing as using a nuclear bomb.
Well, now the social moral landscape has shifted again. If you're a woman and you're not a proud champion of smut, then you're the enemy of women. In general, though, I think the so-called social bias surrounding romance novels isn't much different from the bias surrounding all commercial fiction. I also don't think that's done that much to stop women from mass consuming romance novels. Champions of romance novels will present the acceptance of smut as crucial to female empowerment and independence. This is categorically false, and in fact, I think I've shown how the opposite is true. But women will nevertheless be banished from female society by other women if they dare to disagree.
That expands across all of society in multiple areas. Okay. The idea that the patriarchy is what's oppressing women is patently incorrect. Women are oppressed, judged, and shamed far more by other women than they are by men. Right. The reason that a woman might make a choice to do or not do something is far more affected by her perception of what other women will think about it, more so than by what men and broader society will think about it. This is particularly a problem in the West. But yeah, that's women are oppressed by other women more so than by men.
Men typically who watch hardcore stuff or who are addicted to it are ashamed of it. Women who are addicted to reading, as they call it, smut, are supposed to be proud of it. None of these women will allow any talk of shame. But here's the thing. Shame is not a bad thing. Shame is how our brains tell us we're doing something that will harm us.
Yes.
If we feel shame eating that fourth slice of triple chocolate cake in one sitting, that's our brain telling us that this is bad for our health.
Yep.
If we feel shame because we haven't exercised in over 6 months, that's our brain telling us that we need physical exercise of some kind. If we feel shame when we take in hardcore explicit material, that's our brain telling us that this is going to harm us in some way and we need to stop. This
is something that one of my younger brothers has talked about with me a bit here and there, but something that adults experience. And I would say I think all adults experience it to some degree, but some who are more self-conscious, perhaps more than others, is when you think back on your past, something you did when you were younger and you cringe at it, right? You experience shame after the fact, even years after the fact, you experience shame and you get that real awkward cringe moment. That's a good thing. That's actually a good thing. What that means is that you have grown. Right? That is an internal indicator that you have grown beyond that behavior, behind that action, behind that thought process. You have actually grown as a person, right? So it's a good thing to feel that. Maybe not a good thing to feel that a lot, because, the area where that's not good means that you were really not good much farther back in your past. But it is still good to have felt that so that you know that you have grown beyond that.
is our brain trying to save us. Eventually, anyone can be desensitized to shame, but the effort to desensitize women to shame has been a lot more intensive than it has been for men, because historically, women have led the charge against indecent or sexually explicit material. So, shame in women cuts into hardcore film producers and women's lit publishers' bottom line. Removing shame from women's minds doesn't just prevent them from bullying hardcore erotica production out of the mainstream, it mobilizes 50% of the spending force of the book market to obsessively consume something that is dangerously addictive. This is a huge reason why it's becoming increasingly common for harder and harder content in books to be made available to a younger and younger audience, especially a young female audience. You see incredibly steamy makeout scenes in books marketed to 12-year-old girls. Caraval, for example, has 2 prolonged passages that read like weird hand fetish scenes. This isn't some kind of accidental slip of the pen. This is intentional. Famously, Sarah J. Maas only allowed her book to be marketed to a YA audience if they didn't cut out any of the explicit material. Slap a feminist female empowerment sticker on the thing and you've got social moral armor no one is willing to touch.
Wait. She refused to allow her books to be marketed to young adults meaning teenagers, if any of the explicit content was removed. Right? So you couldn't just remove the explicit content and let her books sell to young adult audiences on the merit of the actual fantasy aspect. And by fantasy, I mean Lord of the Rings style fantasy, elves, gnomes, orcs, and the like, swords and daggers, and kingdoms and courts and whatnot. She didn't want to sell her books on the merits of that aspect of the content. She insisted that the explicit sections of it had to be present for young adults to receive the content. That's just absolutely degenerate. And it's the same thing for Hollywood. Like Hollywood does the same thing. That's why Clean Flicks, the organization I mentioned earlier, they're not around anymore. And they're not around anymore because Hollywood got big mad that all of the degenerate content was being removed from their movies, which is wild because, explain to me how this can be done for music. Right? With music, there has always been, albums that have an explicit version of the album and then the safer version of the album where all the profanity has been removed and the more explicit content, not all of it because the music industry is just as degenerate. But that's something that's always existed, is that there's an explicit version of a song and then there's a non-explicit version of a song. So I don't know why movies are somehow different, right? That you can't just not have the explicit version. And now it seems literature is going the same route. Clean Flicks underwent a lawsuit and they went under and they no longer existed because of their removal of explicit content. After that, there was another organization called Holly Good that did the same thing. And the way they got around what sank Clean Flicks was they gave you both copies, the explicit and the non-explicit, and they disabled the explicit version. But you still got it. They were still selling you the explicit version. You just couldn't watch it. And the reason you couldn't watch it is because the actual label is like they printed out sticker labels and then plastered that over the explicit version or the explicit side of the disc. So you couldn't watch that side of the disc. And, on the other side was the edited version. And that lasted for a little while. And they eventually came under a similar lawsuit and they went under for the same reasons. But yeah, Hollywood's no different. They're doing the same thing and it's just as bad. It's just crazy to think about somebody who's like, no, I need for the young people to have to read this degenerate content that I'm watching. Could you imagine a pornography director, refusing to market the pizza delivery video unless it had all the explicit content? Kids aren't just allowed to watch the pizza be delivered. It's a funny example. You can laugh, yes. And kids aren't allowed to sit and wonder if she ever pays for the pizza. Because like that the director just wants them to watch the rest of it. It's so debauch.
Not even other women. Something I hear a lot is that this is all the result of women taking over literature. I definitely see the point, but I was curious if that was true. So I, took to the internet. The percentage of female authors as of 2019, which was the most recent number I could find, any further statistics were likely behind this mother of all pay gates, was 50.5%, which was also fairly steady from 2010 to 2019. The percentage of female editors as of 2021 was 67%. Funnily enough, that's not that big of an increase from 2010 when the number was 64%. The percentage of female literary agents as of 2021 was 58%, which is actually a decline from 2010 when the number was 64%. So that's people. Now, what about the books that are actually being read? Let's look at the New York Times bestseller list for the last 4.5 years. In 2020, out of 34 best-selling authors, 16 were women. In 2021, 21 out of 37 were women. In 2022, 12 out of 22 were women. In 2023, 11 out of 24. In 2024, 17 out of 32. And so far in 2025, it's been about 8 out of 13. The point of all these numbers is to say that statistically women don't dominate the literary world. That said, in many ways, the numbers here don't quite represent the reality. No matter what the numbers say for bestsellers, if you actually look at the list, you can see that romance, especially smutty romance and romantasy, dominate huge blocks of the calendar. And a lot of these female writers have female agents. And obviously, readers of these books will be predominantly female. So women might not quite statistically dominate the literary world, but the literary world, nevertheless, seems to have taken a very particular female leaning. I take issue with my own phrasing here a little. I would say that there are definitely other types of female writers working today, but the idea that this is somehow an example of typically female writing or a typically female writer is something I find incredibly frustrating and just a little bit insulting. But here's the thing. This fact, the fact that women dominate the literary industry, is not what created this problem. This problem has existed for a long time. What problem am I talking about? Call it what you want, but let's just say it's the widespread and constantly increasing reliance on explicitly sexual content to sell books, at least in part. This novel is seductive and compelling, or a meditation on the erotic, or an erotic black comedy, or a tour de force of erotic realism, or a book in which seduction beats suspense. And these are not recent books. Some of these were published over 20 or 30 years ago. It's there visually too, like the naked woman on the cover of Jaws, this cover of Windmills of the Gods, or the old pulpy covers of sword and sorcery paperbacks. The thing is, a lot of these books that had these blurbs and these terrible covers usually had very limited sex in the books. And when it did appear, it kind of just came out of nowhere. The reality is, however, that no matter what the writers thought, the publishers knew that a little sprinkling of sex would let them mention it in the publicity, and that would boost sales. After a few generations.
Beer commercials. Beer commercials always had the swimsuit model, which we've gotten away from. And look, the industry has reaped the consequences of that decision in trying to cater to feminism, because obviously men liked those old commercials. It's the oldest profession. It has always sold, and that's never not going to be the case.
Cycle through this system using sex to sell an otherwise mediocre or even terrible book is not even something that's questioned. For that matter, using sex to sell an excellent book isn't even questioned. Eventually, you reach a point where sex is the main point of the book.
That's true. That's true. I think it was Shoe on Head, who's another YouTuber. She talked about this issue in particular and touched on that, how that kind of became the main point, to the degree that there were women who were complaining about the fact that fantasy books, and I mean, like, again, actual fantasy, sword and dagger kind of fantasy, Lord of the Rings type fantasy, that it didn't have enough explicit content in it, to the point that they were essentially asking, where's the fantasy? Because for them, that is the fantasy. It's not the fact that it takes place in another world with a whole anthology and mythical creatures that don't exist. It's the fantasy is the explicit content. And so, reading something like The Lord of the Rings would inflame and anger them because there was no fantasy in it, meaning that there was no explicit content in it. And it's comical. It's also extremely sad. Like, that's tragic that people's minds have become that broken.
What I'm trying to say here is that the current year situation did not arise entirely out of thin air. Like, the second women started to dominate literature, everything became smut. I would concede that everything has become women-centric smut, or you could say smut written for women by women. But this issue, this almost virulent proliferation of smut, as it were, in literature has been a thing for a long time.
That is true.
The main difference is that previously some books were written by men and some by women. On top of that, the overall quality used to be higher, so the sex didn't really stand out, nor were the publishers leaning as heavily on the explicit content to sell the books.
Hold on. So in a much older time, when more men were writing this kind of content, the storytelling itself was actually better, and it was better writing that perhaps didn't have as much of this explicit content. But as this field has been increased in the amount of female authorship with a bent towards a female audience, the writing has actually gotten worse, but the explicit content has increased. That's hilarious.
Given that the books and the authors were generally of a higher quality in and of themselves. I can't read the minds of the women who wrote articles like these ones, but I'd guess that a major complaint a lot of these women really had when it came right down to it was that the sex written by the men didn't really appeal to them. Is the issue that the sex isn't universally appealing? Or is the issue that sex as a selling point for fiction has become one of the most important aspects of the reading experience? And if that's true, why is that? I've read so many essays and articles and quotes written by men and women over the years who talk like sex is literally a mandatory element of fiction, whether it's a writer talking about how books without sex are insincere, or Philip Pullman, who apparently can't figure out where elf babies come from unless he can read an explicit account of the moment of conception. Things like this are so incredibly silly to me. I'm tempted to make a joke about Philip Pullman being unable to comprehend where the people he sees on the street come from unless he watched the act of conception with his own eyes.
That would be a good joke to make.
But there's no way he's that stupid. I mean that sincerely. There's no way. In which case, the only other explanation is that he's just trying.
He thought that argument was a good argument. That's pretty stupid to me. So he might be that stupid.
To make an excuse for how badly he wants there to be lots of sex in books for him to both read and write. In that sense, one could argue that as ludicrous and worrying as it is that women are becoming so obsessed with the smut in their fiction, at least they're not pretending that they're in it for anything else. So many writers have repeated the same nonsensical argument that because sex is a natural part of the human condition, failing to include it in your novel would make it unrealistic or disingenuous. What strikes me the most about this argument is the lack of self-awareness. Bowel movements are also a natural part of the human condition, but I don't see people using bowel movement scenes to sell books. I also don't see that many bowel movements in romantasy. For that matter, childbirth is also a natural part of.
Women don't poop. And they don't fart.
The human condition. And while that's a bit more likely to make it into a novel than a bowel movement, it also doesn't get championed the way sex does. Gosh, I wonder why that is. Listen, I'm not saying sex is bad and you can't put it in your book. I don't really care. What I am saying is that this ludicrous argument.
I care a lot. I don't think it should be in your book. I think if you actually can't write a story without that, you're probably just a bad writer. Right? If you can't sell a story on the merits of the actual story without this, then you're a bad writer. Kind of the same way that all of pornography actually, they're bad. It's bad movies. it's again, to use like the does she really pay for the pizza, like it's such bad, and that's because they're not making it for the plot, obviously. So they're just not trying for the story at all. And I think that literature has kind of suffered from the same thing, in that, like she said, the intimate and explicit parts of the books have become the main point of them, and that's why a lot of it is actually bad writing. She hasn't said it yet. I don't know if she does in the video at any point, but a lot of these books that are very popular now, it's genuinely bad writing. It's actually bad writing. 50 Shades is bad writing. Twilight was bad writing. It's awful story writing. So much so that the movies, in retrospect, they were just awful movies to watch in the first place. Is a horrible experience to have to sit through because, dating a girl who wanted to go see them. And so you did the good boyfriend thing and took her to see them. But the last time that I watched through them, it was actually comical how cringe a lot of the dialogue in those movies were. The Twilight movies, not the 50 Shades. Twilight in particular. Not that 50 Shades doesn't have bad dialogue, I just don't know. But yeah, the dialogue in Twilight was just god awful. And it's the same for the books. It's actually just bad writing. It's not good writing.
That books without sex are somehow bad is intolerably false. These people fail to recognize that they just sound...
Yeah, Lord of the Rings is easily one of the best novels, the best fantasy series to have, if not the, I'm going to say it's the best. It actually may not be a popular opinion for like the George R.R. Martin fans or some of the other more obscure fantasies, your Dune fans and whatnot. Lord of the Rings is the best. And the reason I know Lord of the Rings is the best is because Lord of the Rings is the standard that everybody else compares themselves to. Tolkien is the best. Tolkien practically invented fantasy as we know it today. And no sex. No sex. One of the best authors of the last 200 years. No sex. And that's because Tolkien was a good storyteller.
Like a writer or a reader who's mad because they didn't get to read a super poetic description of boobs in this spy thriller. I'm sorry, but it just comes across like that guy who's mad because there are too many articles in this month's Playboy. Or that fangirl who's upset because her favorite idol's outfit didn't reveal enough leg. Like, at a certain point, you've got to stop and ask yourself, wait, why is the sex scene so important to me? Why does it matter how round this random
Good
female
question.
character's boobs are? Why does this author feel the need to describe what this guy's hands taste like? If you put so much emphasis on using sex to sell books, then a huge chunk of people who buy the books will expect sex. Every time the cycle repeats, the amount of sex increases and the level of quality decreases. If this cycle repeats enough times, everyone stops noticing how important the sex has become to the whole process. They also stop noticing how low the overall quality of the books has become.
Yep.
If the reader is expecting a little sex, then the publishers can add a little more to make the book stand out from the crowd, and so on until we get to... and so on. But I mean, sex has become increasingly centric in literature for the last century, going as far back as the likes of Lady Chatterley's Lover and James Joyce's Ulysses, and even farther back to Fanny Hill, and let's not forget our boy the Marquis. Of course, these older examples tended to get themselves a tiny bit banned, while Lady Chatterley's Lover and Ulysses both tried to make some kind of ironic...
No way. Older societies banned these books? Societies that had like an incredibly prominent moral center banned these books? No way.
Righteous First Amendment case for erotica being a super important form of art or whatever. But again, who do you suppose benefited from the legalization of explicit content in books? Human society or publishers? The debate about whether or not wildly explicit material is protected by the American First Amendment has been renewed in recent years. But I do find it interesting that those who argue the strongest for it are making a shocking amount of money. The main issue I'm trying to make here is twofold. One, sex on the level we see in books like this and this has actually been normal for a long time, not just in bodice rippers, but in highbrow award-winning literature. So much so...
Yeah, I always forget about that. I've never read Stephen King's It. That was one of the pictures that she showed there. I've never read it. I've seen the movies, and that's it. But apparently there's a pretty explicit part of that whole book dealing with children, which when the book came out, like, it's just shocking that people just accepted that. and that it became like so iconic that like people who saw the movie wanted to go and read the book and were subjected to that. Um, yeah, I won't go into full detail about what has been described to me as that particular event in the book, but yeah, it deals with only children. There's no adults that are used. That doesn't make it any better. But it's just it takes place when the main protagonists in the story are all children, all with each other, and it's crazy to think that that book became that popular, having that part of it present. So she's right. Yeah, this is not new. It's been around for a while.
That when this issue took off and I started seeing people everywhere complaining or at least expressing alarm at romantasy, while I didn't disagree, I completely agree, I was still pretty surprised. Hadn't we, as a reading society, decided decades ago that we were all apparently perfectly fine with insane amounts of sexual obsession in our fiction? I'm pretty sure we had. The second issue I want to mention is that
we didn't. And maybe that's the answer to the question that I just posed, is we didn't. Society did not agree to that. Because let's face it, initially it was a pretty niche crowd that read Stephen King's books. It was. And fantasy especially, right? Because that was one of those, like, cringy, ooh, that's the kid who plays Dungeons and Dragons, right? He's the nerd. He's weird, and all the things that he engages in are weird. And so, like, it just hasn't been exposed to broader society the way that it is now, where it is mainstream and it is basically just everybody who's engaging in it. So yeah, I don't think we all agreed to that. I think that it entered via a very niche crowd and then was later popularized so that it would span across all of society. And that's the case for a lot of things. A lot of things in society have entered society and then become popularized later after being introduced to a very niche crowd that the rest of society at the time didn't know what they were consuming, because none of them engaged in it and none of them consumed it. And so they just didn't actually know what was in it.
Even though the female aspect of this whole thing has a very distinctive look to it, men have also been writing piles of smut-esque literature for just as long. As I said at the beginning, I don't find this to be a women in literature problem. I look at this as a smut in literature problem, for lack of a better term. I think it's worth noting that highbrow literature has always had more sex in it, while commercial fiction has tended to have less. I think a big reason that this has become such a major issue that so many people are noticing is that the commercial fiction is now just as smutty and explicit as highbrow literature has been for a long time. The other day, I was reading a book by Paul Auster. This guy is a novelist, one of the respected literary giants of his generation, legitimately a good writer, or I should say a good put-together of words and sentences, if you will. Not 20 pages into this book, and his character was constantly examining his genitals. He was imagining what any random woman looked like naked the minute he met her, and every character, male and female, had to make sure their sexual habits and tastes were on the page within the course of the first meeting. This is the kind of thing that was much more common in books, especially literary fiction written by men, something you could almost call ambient explicitness, or even sometimes ambient perversion. It was there always on almost every page, no matter what the book was about. I personally find this kind of writing tasteless and baffling, but I do think that we as a society became desensitized to it. Now, women reading explicit fiction or fiction with extremely explicit elements are also becoming increasingly desensitized. That's why you can look up things like spice meters. Do you want a book to, read one-handed? Or do you just want to read a story? Well, the spice is going to be there regardless, but here you can at least gauge the quantity based on the specific level of desensitization you've reached. Men have been putting taste...
That's such a good way of phrasing that, is that these meters are really just, they are a gauge of exactly how desensitized a person has become. It is not a gauge of the quality of writing or the quality of the story arc or the plot. It is a gauge of exactly how debauch a person has become. Wow, yeah, that's a very good way of describing that.
and excessive sex in books for a long time. Just because women are the ones writing it doesn't mean it's not also tasteless. And it also doesn't mean that many male writers aren't just as obsessed with sex.
I didn't really like the books I read in school because there was never any magic, but there was really like not enough kissing for me.
Well, I'm saying, where are the giant snakes? Where are the scantily clad women?
Anyone who has tried to read a book off the shelf in Barnes & Noble in the last 5 years does not need to be told that the quality of Western literature is in decline. This is true across the board, and there are a million factors that have contributed to this, but like it or not, sex is one of them. The more you let sex sell the story, the less concerned you'll be with the quality of the story. Sex sells, as we all know. It sells so well.
You know what? I'm glad that she included that video clip of George R.R. Martin, because it highlights one point, just being able to look at the guy. I mean, one of the distinguishing points between him and Tolkien, because again, I'm going to bring up Tolkien, particularly in comparison to George R.R. Martin, because I have heard far too many people say that George R.R. Martin surpassed Tolkien. That is a lie. That is not true in any capacity. Game of Thrones is good in its own right, okay? It does have too much sex in it. Again, any really is too much at this point, but there's a shocking amount in Game of Thrones. But the story overall actually is decent as far as the actual fantasy aspects go, and it is decent storytelling, but it's not Lord of the Rings. And one of the big differences between the two is that George R.R. Martin was a perverted D&D nerd. He was, and I'm not knocking D&D. I like D&D. I play D&D. It's a good time, right? Especially if you have a good imagination, or you like doing vocal impressions, if you like speaking with accents, if you like inventing your own character and their own backstory, right? D&D is great. But that's now that D&D has kind of entered the mainstream, whereas, back in his time, it really was kind of something that was more niche and excluded to one type of person. That was the type of person that we would call an incel today, because they probably didn't have that much luck with women in general. And he kind of seems like the same person today. Tolkien wasn't that. Tolkien was like a legitimate academic. Tolkien was a master linguist. Tolkien has translated some of the most ancient documents known to man into a readable language. Tolkien was a refined gentleman. Tolkien was a war hero. Tolkien fought in World War I. George R.R. Martin fought in Vietnam. A broader discussion could be had regarding the merits of those two and the lived experience between those two men. But Tolkien was at one of the worst points of World War I. And I think that that's where part of the beauty of Lord of the Rings comes out. Is I think that he was able to turn some of his PTSD, or really back then it would have been shell shock, and he was able to channel that into this beautiful masterpiece today, where you can actually, again, if you've studied enough about Tolkien, you can see the aspects of his own lived experience before and during the war, and even after the war, that worked their way into his anthology. And it is absolutely masterful. Lord of the Rings is a masterpiece. It's beautiful. And Tolkien is a cut above. He's an actual refined gentleman. George R.R. Martin is not. He's a D&D nerd who wanted to see women naked. That it's just base.
That if you want, you could ignore most everything else. The bodice rippers of the past and the romantasy genre now, and their shocking success, has proven that. If the sex is explicit enough, tantalizing enough, controversial enough, nothing else matters. If you put a stack of books on the table and tell people the ones with the purple covers have lots of sex, the unfortunate reality is that those are the ones that will sell out first. The industry knows this. It's hard work to find good writers. It's hard work to write a good novel. Hard work to edit it well and then market it. Putting really explicit sex in the book means that the story doesn't have to be that great. It means you can cut all the other corners. It means people won't really be paying attention to the prose or the grammar.
Right.
It means that all you'll have to do is slap a blurb on the cover that says something like, "Summer's steamiest read," and you're golden. Although, of course, because of the nature of human beings' interaction with explicit content, the sex you put in your stories in order to sell them will necessarily have to be more and more extreme. Of course, this doesn't mean that every book that has ever had explicit sex in it has been otherwise bad. Quite the contrary. Sex often seems to have been shoehorned into otherwise good books. But one does wonder if all this literarily acceptable sex perhaps paved the way for a world of this and this and this.
Song of Ice and
Is
Fire.
smut only reprehensible if it's badly written? Is it only reprehensible if it's on the bestseller list? Or is all this a symptom of a much, much larger social disease that has been degrading our culture for a very, very long time? The reality is that sex is 100% optional. And even then, there are times when the story might benefit from skipping the sex. And also, this bears repeating, there's literally never a good enough plot reason to describe every single action, motion, and sensation of a sex scene. There just isn't. Does that mean all sex in fiction is bad? No, of course not. Does that mean that all books that have sex in them are bad? Again, of course not. But unlike some authors who seem to believe that a book can't exist without explicit content, I am of the mind that certain things are better handled with restraint. As I said before, the largest group of people who have worked so tirelessly to normalize the consumption of erotic media are people whose sole motivation is profit. They do not care about female empowerment. They don't even care about female health. They just care about female money. So I think it might be time for females to wake up. But while women are waking up, maybe it wouldn't be the worst thing for the gents to also take stock. I hesitate to tell people what to do to fix this. It's easy to talk about the problem. Well, maybe not easy, but not difficult in the same way. You know that old thing that was everywhere a few years ago? You know, you have two wolves fighting inside you and the one that wins is the one that you feed. We all have so much inside us, impulses to good and to bad, pulls to be selfish, pulls to be courageous or deviant or compassionate or lazy. And whatever we feed day to day is what we become. If we feed the impulse to obsess over sex, that's what we will become. And on a long enough timeline, we'll become a perverted sex addict. The same goes for society. Maybe things in literature are the way they are because we've been feeding perversion for too long. Now there are no other strong hungers, no hunger for powerful storytelling, for aspirational heroes, for nuanced characters, beautiful prose, and so on. It's like society has become the monkey that pushes the pleasure button instead of the food button until it dies. Maybe we should consider starving that particular hunger and see what happens. As always, thank you so much for watching.
Yeah. On what she just commented on, there are other aspects of society, particularly Hollywood, where this has become a problem, not with sex necessarily, but with irony and humor. There's a loss of sincerity in movie making, right? There used to be very good, very compelling movies with incredible plots that spoke to people. They touched people's hearts. And we don't have a lot of that anymore because of Marvel, really. I am going to blame Marvel in particular, and in particular, Guardians of the Galaxy. Now, I'm a huge Marvel fan, huge Marvel nerd. I think some of you may know that already. I've talked about it before. And I enjoy all of the Marvel movies to a degree, some of them not so much. And I really enjoy Guardians of the Galaxy. The comedic approach that they took to that was well suited for Guardians of the Galaxy. But because that worked so well, Marvel decided to integrate that into every movie that they made about every character, where all of the sincere emotional tension is almost always broken by some kind of ironic joke, where there's a punchline hidden around every serious moment. And that's just taken from the quality of the movie. Like, Marvel just went all in on ironic humor because it's what sold very well in one instance, and it just downgraded the quality of everything else that they did. And so, you know, the human tendency to do this with whatever makes them the most money is problematic. And, you know, there we go. Money is the root of all evil. Like, was there any statement that was ever more true? Several. The Torah is full of them. But yeah, this is an extreme problem. I understand that it hasn't been given as much attention as it probably should have, and that's the reason that a lot of people don't know the extreme problem that it is. A lot of people haven't known exactly how explicit and how debauched the nature of what's written about is in these novels, and the effect that it's having on women in broader society. It is an extreme problem. It does have the same effects on women's brains that porn does, and it is affecting their relationships in much the same way. And I think that it needs to be given attention. I'm not saying to take attention away from the problem of men's consumption of pornography. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that women's consumption of smut needs to be given as much attention as men's consumption of porn. And I don't think that really is a controversial take. It shouldn't be. That should be something that we can all more or less agree with. I don't think that that's anything that's I don't think that's offensive. It shouldn't be offensive. If you're offended by it, then maybe there's some internal stock taking that you should take if you're offended by that. Because I think that's something that everybody can agree with. That is true equality. That's treating everybody as equal. That being said, before we close out,
Very ignorant pastor's section of hell. It will be filled. Not a bad synopsis.
So I finally watched the movie David, and there was a big to-do. There was a big controversy in Christian TikTok over whether or not it was comparable to The Prince of Egypt. It's not. Fight me. It was good. Don't get me wrong. It was good. But it was not Prince of Egypt. It wasn't really even General DreamWorks quality. It was a Christian Pixar movie. And on the merits of being compared to Pixar movies, like Moana, like Frozen, like the 3D Disney variety of movies, Encanto and what have you, it was good. And I would argue it was every bit as good, if not even a little better than a lot of those movies. The music in it was very good, respective to those movies. It was not The Prince of Egypt. The musical scores in it were good for a Pixar movie. They were not iconic the way that The Prince of Egypt was. The cast also just was not as iconic as The Prince of Egypt was. And I would dare say the societal impact of the movie was not the same that The Prince of Egypt was, okay? And that's not for lack of attention, right? The Christian world went far and wide to try and watch this movie. But even the secular world acknowledges exactly how masterful The Prince of Egypt was. The movie is an absolute masterpiece. It is iconic. It is an epic. And there are atheist kids today that will still watch that movie because it is a good movie. And that has to do with a little bit of what we've talked about here, just the general overall storytelling. The storytelling in The Prince of Egypt was absolutely top tier, right? It was stellar. And not to say that David wasn't good storytelling. It was okay. It was decent. I would watch the movie again, right? My daughter certainly enjoyed it. It's just not The Prince of Egypt, right? It's not. Come for me in the comments if you want. That's fine. We can even schedule an actual debate about it. I'm willing to die on this hill that David was not as good as The Prince of Egypt. It's not to say it's not a good movie. It was a great movie, but it was not The Prince of Egypt. And on that note, thank you for enduring me.